Good evening, comrades. Welcome to a new sub-series that we're organizing as part of Why Marx, which is another ABC of Marxism series on imperialism. We thought it's a hugely important subject, considering that we are closer to World War III than ever before. It's not, we're not that close, so nobody panic yet, but it is a very important issue that we should discuss. What exactly is meant by imperialism? Can there be capitalism without imperialism, for example? What did Lenin and Luxemburg have to say on the matter? Is Russia an imperialist country? What about China? If not, does it mean we have to support either of them? Or, if they are imperialist countries, does that mean we have to support the lesser evil? So there's lots of interesting issues to discuss on these matters, and that are important for the here and now. But we're starting looking a bit back and looking at what Lenin had to say on the matter with tonight's introduction by Ian Spencer. Thank you for organizing this, Ian.
Good evening, comrades, and you're very welcome. It's no better time to be talking about it, really, as after all, Britain is now a co-belligerent alongside Israel and Ukraine, engaged in two wars, and costing already tens of thousands of lives, if not already into the hundreds of thousands. So imperialism then is something which has run like a vein through Marxist theory, really, from the outset. Marx and Engels talked extensively about imperialism in their writings, and of course Engels wrote extensively about things like the Crimean War and the American Civil War, and placed them in the context of world capitalism. And so, from that point of view, it has an impeccable lineage as a topic for Marxists to talk about. But what I'm going to focus on today is Lenin in particular, in his book Imperialism, the Highest Form of Capitalism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It's an important book in all sorts of ways, and interestingly, of course, it was written as a popular book on the topic, that is to say, a highly accessible book. And on rereading it in preparation for this, I was surprised at just how accessible it is, in fact. So without further ado, before we get into Lenin directly, it of course won't have escaped anybody's notice that empires predate capitalism. Here is the Roman Empire, for example, at its kind of height. This is about 117 of the Common Era. But mere territorial gains, simply seizing hold of land and extracting a surplus of one sort or another, does not of itself equate to imperialism that Lenin was talking about in his book. Firstly, what's the nature of the surplus in the ancient world? It's very different to the present. It's very different to the nature of the surplus under capitalism. Marx, in volume 3 of Capital, talks about something which defines the nature of a mode of production is the way in which the surplus is extracted from the working population. So here, for example, in ancient Rome, we're not talking about free labor. About the time of Augustus, about 35% of the population of the Roman Empire was enslaved. Probably the majority were, in some sense, peasants working on the land, not necessarily free, some of whom in the later period of the Roman Empire were closer to being like serfs rather than slaves. That is to say, they were tied to the land, if not necessarily chattel slaves. The other point about it is, of course, the form that the surplus took was often in the form of, as it were, direct use values in a sense. So tribute, for example, extracted from various parts of the empire. One of the reasons, for example, for Claudius's incorporation of Britannia into the Roman Empire was slaves, lead, silver, gold, and of course, the other important aspect is just things like grain to feed Rome. Parts of the empire were there to supply grain, notably Egypt, for example. So the point is that the form taken by the extraction of a surplus in the ancient world is very different to what we see in a modern capitalist society. We see here the direct extraction of slaves, and often by just simply the direct support of military force. If you don't deliver up the number of slaves we've asked for or the amount of gold we've demanded, we will simply come and enslave the lot of you or kill you or something of that nature. So direct force, and also, of course, Rome didn't just use the Roman army to extract a surplus from everywhere. I mean, there were vassal states established. So at various times, for example, Palestine was relatively independent, but of course, as a result of rebellions, was later placed under the governorship of a Roman with the Roman army present. So the other aspect of it, and this is, of course, crucially important because it's something that is a central feature of Marxism, is that systems come into being and they die away. So the Roman Empire, for example, and if you are watching the latest kind of swords and sandals thing on Amazon television, those who are about to die, you get the impression that the collapse of the Roman Empire and that kind of thing was down to the kind of capriciousness of individual emperors. And of course, that may well have played a part. But what you also see, for example, in the decline of the Roman Empire is already changing relations of production and the nature of the surplus exhausting large parts of the Roman Empire. Added to that, you have accident combined with necessity. So Italy being subjected to malaria at a crucial point meant that it was more easy to defeat the Roman army. So empires come and empires go, and it's not just simply because of the whim or the folly of individual emperors or leaders, but often because of a deep-rooted contradiction in the nature of that mode of production. And what we then see, of course, is with the dismemberment of the Roman Empire into East and West, you eventually get a transition to feudalism. So not only are there empires which predate capitalism and the extraction of the surplus, but also international trade predates capitalism. And so you get a kind of mercantile capital. Arguably, one of the reasons for the Black Death in the 14th century is that you have international trade, and with that, the transportation of black rats and the plague bacillus. So it's already an illustration about how widespread international trade was. So that's to contrast it with the imperialism that Lenin was talking about. When Lenin was actually writing Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, it was obviously against the background of World War I. Lenin was at the time exiled in Zurich. It's interesting because I've taken page references and things from volume 22 of Lenin's collected works, which is where you'll find Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. Originally, it was published as Imperialism, the newest stage of capitalism, although in the handwritten manuscript it was Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. It also, of course, republished it in 1920 with a kind of preface around, which included, for example, the making reference to the Versailles Treaty and Brest-Litovsk and the punitive measures that were applied to the young Soviet Republic as a condition for peace with Germany. So published in 1917 in Petrograd, it was published legally, although Tsarism had been toppled in the February Revolution, there was still significant censorship. And in order to avoid that, Lenin wrote it in a particular way. He wrote it in a way which was, as it were, rather kind of scholarly, but for a popular audience. And that's exactly what he was aiming for. However, One of the problems with imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, is that it's often been treated as the textbook on imperialism. And there are lots of reasons for that, and we can talk about that in the discussion. But so, but in fact, it was written as like so many of Lenin's work, as a particular pamphlet at a particular time with a particular debate in mind. In this case, crucially, it was a critique of Karl Kautsky. Karl Kautsky, as you know, leading the German Social Democrats, and the decision of the German Social Democrats to effectively support the war credits leading to imperialist war. Karl Kautsky's Ultra Imperialism, which is available online and is rather short, quite readable, is the principal thing that Lenin is criticizing, and as if as if to teach Karl Kautsky a lesson, as it were, he published it just before the outbreak of World War One, and many of the things in ultra imperialism were left looking rather silly simply by the very outbreak of World War One. Never mind what happened afterwards. Lenin was also in a debate with Rudolf Hilferding, and Finance Capital, which was published in 1910. Given that Lenin was in exile in Zurich, he didn't really have, I mean, he's no slouch, and there's a vast wealth of secondary material, but he was rather limited in what he could do in terms of secondary materials. He didn't have the sort of whole libraries of the Russian Empire at his disposal or anything like it. But nevertheless, he made a pretty good fist of it, but lent very heavily on the English economist John Hobson, Imperialism: A Study, published in 1902. Hobson himself was an interesting character, most unusual to be English at that time and anti-imperialist. One of the things that influenced Hobson in his anti-imperialism was the Second Boer War. Hobson was, in a sense, maybe coming towards the last of those English writers who were effectively more wedded to the idea of free trade than imperialism, in the sense that what we'll see in Lenin's work is this counterposition between the kind of heroic free trade period of capitalism in its ascendancy and the assertion of imperialism as a particular period in the decline of capitalism. Not only is it, in Lenin's terms, the highest stage of capitalism, but it's also a period of capitalism in which capitalism is, as it were, rotten ripe for a revolution. The question is, of course, was he right then, and is he still right now? So John Hobson, also as an interesting footnote to this, some people will remember during the debacle of the anti-Semitism nonsense around the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn was asked to write a short preface or something to John Hobson's work. And of course, what people immediately jumped on, and of course there couldn't have been any kind of conspiracy involved in this, could there, was the fact that John Hobson was a raving anti-Semite. Hobson himself associated finance capital, associated with banking capital, with, as it were, worldwide Jewry, and from that point was a raging anti-Semite. But nevertheless, his writings on imperialism are cited by Lenin as, in many ways, superior to that of Kautsky and superior to that of Hilferding in some respects. So if we leave aside Hobson's undoubted anti-Semitism, his contribution to Lenin's thought is an important one. There are 10 chapters in Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, but I won't go through them one by one. However, it starts with an important discussion around combination and monopoly. This is the Krupp gun factory. Gun in this context means, artillery pieces, not just rifles and pistols. And of course, Krupp played a vital role in the industrialization of Germany. I think there were no less than 5 kings turned up to Krupp's funeral when he died. Kaiser Wilhelm II spoke of him as a German of the Germans. And the Krupp factory, interestingly, was virtually a whole town. It had its own shops, it had its own railway, it had its own banks, crucially, and constituted a huge concentration of capital. And it's precisely this concentration and combination that Lenin is drawing upon when he's talking about the development of finance capital. So he sees the development of capital away from instead of the competition between small, isolated, different capitals, instead huge accumulations of capital in the form of factories, which then also own mines, which also then own railways, which also then own smelting plants and all the rest of it. And therefore the development of a monopoly situation. And if not direct monopoly, then trusts and cartels, agreements between huge monopolies to control prices and so on. And so what you then see is arguably something which, on the one hand, socializes production, but also becomes somewhat dysfunctional from the point of view of the heroic phase of capitalism's ascendancy. Moreover, such large combinations of monopolies end up becoming closely interrelated with banks, either by the banks themselves having a controlling role in industrial production, becoming part of finance capital. And Lenin here says, production becomes social, but appropriation remains private. That all sounds very familiar. The social means of production remain the private property of the few. And so, on the one hand, we see the end of a heroic period of capitalism and moving to a mature, ripened, arguably over-ripened period of capitalism and the beginning of its decline. The picture I couldn't resist. It's ironically it's a 1932 poster, and it's in Cyrillic letters. It says Rot Front, which is of course German, Red Front. And here the worker is smashing the Birj, which is a Russianization of the French Bourse, the stock exchange. And you'll be delighted to know the word at the bottom, and the Russian for bank is bank. And so here is the worker smashing finance capital, as it were. And just a reminder of where we are on this. You'll recall from the beginning of kind of why Marx about the difference between the simple circulation of commodities, where a commodity is exchanged for money in order to exchange it for another commodity. So a craftsperson makes a pair of shoes, takes it to the marketplace, sells it, and buys a coat. A commodity is exchanged for another, and that's the end of it. By contrast, capitalist commodity production, the capitalist starts with money. He buys commodities, which could include labor power as well as raw materials, and that yields more value than merely the commodities he paid for. So you end up with a potentially endless chain of money, commodity, more money, and more commodities, and even more money. The importance of that, of course, is that eventually what we end up with in rentier capitalism is the production bit in the middle disappears effectively, and you end up with money making money. But for the moment, in discussing finance capital, we see free trade capitalism being counterposed with finance capital, which has become monopolistic, and the interconnected nature of those banks. So we're not just Krupp in Germany, but Armstrong in Britain. If everybody gets the opportunity to come up to Newcastle, you can see Armstrong's factory. You can also see his home near Rothbury, which is a rather beautiful place, as it should be, considering how wealthy he was. And what Lenin is engaged in here, among other things, is, for example, a critique of the sort of notion of the democratization of capital. And you hear this quite a lot, don't you? If you're listening to discussions around the stock market and stock market crashes and all the rest of it. Oh, we're all somehow part of capitalism because we all have a pension and our pension funds are invested in the interest in capital, and therefore, but what of course Lenin is pointing out that this is a long way removed from the truth. Whilst there is the socialization of capital by finance capital, it remains very firmly in private hands, and if not the ownership, then certainly the control. So the ownership of capital from that point of view is separated from production and becomes firmly rooted, for example, into the banks. And the banks then, and bearing in mind when Lenin was writing, you didn't have at that time the same kind of emphasis on fiat capital that you have today. You didn't have the same kind of notion that really money is just a series of noughts and zeros in a computer program. And from that point of view, there was a notion that, if you like, new surplus had to be made, as it were, by real workers working in real factories. And that's an important consideration, the consideration of whether Lenin's imperialism is today as relevant as it was then. I'm going to argue, in a sense, that yes and no. Yes, it is relevant today, but of course, things have moved on somewhat, and we should never regard Lenin, as it were, as the sort of last word on the matter. So what Lenin then, of course, goes on to talk about is the expansion into non-capitalist countries. I mean, once you get to the point where you've got a monopoly and you're extracting a huge surplus from the working population, what you're then looking for is, what do you do with all this capital once you've extracted it? What do you do once you've had to make concessions, for example, to the working class? How do you continue to extract ever greater amounts of profit? Bearing in mind, if we go back to talking about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, industrialization, of course, carries with it the problem associated with a rising organic composition of capital. Sorry about the jargon, but people will remember that what you end up with, given that it's human labor alone, or human labor power, the purchase of human labor power, and it yields labor, which yields more value than it costs to produce. What we end up with is it's a labor theory of value. It's human labor that adds value. Therefore, once you start replacing labor with machinery, you have a tendency of the rate of profit to fall. And in that discussion, if anybody was there, you recall, one of the countervailing factors in that is an impetus to move overseas. You can either move overseas, you can literally move your production overseas in order to extract even greater surplus from a poorer population with a lower standard of living that doesn't require such high wages. Or you can export capital in other ways, for example, in building a railway. And this is one of the reasons why I chose the picture of Cecil Rhodes bestriding Africa like a colossus, building a railway from Cairo to the Cape, including all the British possessions along the way. So you end up with then is expansion into non-capitalist countries and the division of empire, the division of the world into empires. As Lenin says, in one way or another, nearly the whole of the rest of the world is more or less the debtor and tributary of these international banker countries, these four pillars of world finance. And of course, he was writing at a time when the four main imperialist countries were the UK, France, Germany, and the USA. The USA, of course, is an interesting one because its colonial expansion could take place within it's a geographical boundary. Although, of course, if you look at Mexico, is half the size it was as a direct result of US expansion into what had been Mexico. So all of New Mexico, Texas, most of California had all previously been part of Mexico. And we leave aside as well, of course, the displacement and practical genocide of the Native American population. And so what you also see then, of course, is the intensification of the extraction of a surplus from a working population in another country, and their super exploitation relative to the home country. Of course, I've talked about here the four pillars of world finance. I couldn't resist the picture, which of course shows Queen Victoria, Kaiser Wilhelm, Nicholas II, the French symbolized French Republic, and a Japanese samurai carving up China from a French cartoon. The other aspect of it, and it's an important part of Lenin's work, is the place of the working class, the place of the proletariat. Lenin at one point quotes Engels writing on Britain, "There is no Workers' Party here. There are only conservatives and liberal radicals, and the workers gaily share the feast of England's monopoly of the world market and colonies." The other reason for choosing Cecil Rhodes was because Cecil Rhodes was quoted by Lenin as well. I've paraphrased it here somewhat. If you want to avoid civil war, become imperialists. Cecil Rhodes was quite understanding that for example, he recounts seeing a workers' meeting and hearing the kind of demand for higher pay and all the rest of it, and the fact that it was linked to kind of demands for revolution. And here, when he talks about civil war, he is, of course, talking about the possibility of a proletarian revolution. If you want to avoid civil war, if you want to avoid revolution, become imperialists by bringing the untold riches of an empire, and the British Empire was, of course, one quarter of the land surface of the world. The Russian Empire was 1/5 of the land surface of the world. Then, by doing so, you create the conditions for an improvement in the conditions of workers, or at least a particular stratum of workers. And of course, this is where Lenin is really talking about. I don't think in the book he actually uses the term aristocracy of labor, but that's what he's actually talking about. A relatively privileged stratum of the proletariat, or strata of the proletariat. Here I've used a picture of shipyard workers on the Clyde in 1914. The other point, and the reason, of course, why Lenin is engaged in a debate with Kautsky in particular, is, of course, he's suggesting that the basis for social chauvinism, the basis for political opportunism, is precisely that stratum of the proletariat, that relatively privileged sections of the proletariat who enjoy their privileges as a direct consequence of the fruits of imperial exploitation. So, put differently, the poor of the empire, their poverty helps to provide for the relative wealth of a section of a relatively privileged section of the working class in the imperialist countries. And even Hobson talked in terms of Fabian imperialists. And any kind of discussion around, for example, the Second International is interesting from that point of view, because, of course, in the founding congresses of the Second International, you really don't see too many people among the delegates arguing for the liberation of the colonies of those imperialist countries. Most of the delegates to the Second International came from imperialist countries, one way or another. And although they were formally kind of anti-imperialist, as it were, in practice, there were few instances where people were arguing for the freedom of the colonies from imperialist exploitation. So, from that point of view, one can't overstate the importance of imperialism. And if you start to think then about the contemporary relevance of Lenin's work, it really is kind of glaringly obvious. So on the one hand, um, in Lenin's work, we're seeing the idea of monopoly leading to, as it were, stagnation and decay in the context of capitalism. And Lenin cites examples where, for example, uh, in order to prevent the development of competition, you see areas of the world which are part of the colonies have their development impeded. Um, there's a nice illustration of that if anybody's in Hartlepool. There's a wonderful old ship, the HMS Trincomalee. It was actually built in India, and the Indian shipbuilding industry was literally shut down, despite the fact that this was a very advanced piece of naval architecture at the time, in order to not compete with the British shipbuilding industry. And one also sees other examples of monopoly leading to stagnation. So new technology which could revolutionize production in certain areas is simply held back because it is, after all, a monopoly. There's also the whole question around encirclement and partition. One of the features of Lenin's critique of Karl Kautsky was that Kautsky was inclined to see the possibility of, as it were, a peaceful imperialism, a movement towards a situation where imperial competing interests, whilst it might lead to war, could ultimately lead to a situation where the world is divided up into spheres of influence, and the fact that imperialism has a tendency to extend the development of capitalism into areas which were previously undeveloped could be construed as actually suggesting in some way that there was a possibility of a peaceful and progressive imperialism. And the idea of a progressive imperialism was a feature of some of the parties of the Second International. Um, Against that, Lenin is arguing that far from it, that what we see in inter-imperialist rivalry is an inherent tendency to war. Whether it's and one of the examples given by Lenin, for example, was the building of the Baghdad Railway by Germany to cement the alliance between Turkey and Germany, which of course played such an important part in the First World War. By contrast, the aim really on the part of what came to be the Entente powers, Britain, France, and Russia in particular, was an attempt to encircle Germany. So the acquisition, for example, of different bits of the Ottoman Empire, of course, in the Second Balkan War, we see bits of the Ottoman Empire being seized by Austria-Hungary, and of course, the demand for autonomy and independence by, for example, Serbia. So an attempt to encircle Germany and prevent the possibility of an alliance between Germany and Turkey. Another feature, which is an interesting one, of course, is that in looking at the development of the British Empire, even at the height of empire, the British Army was never more than about 300,000 strong. Why? Because actually, much of the soldiering that was done to conquer large parts of the British Empire was done by colonial troops. So the Indian Army at the beginning of the beginning of the First World War was nearly 1 million strong. In no small part because it was Indian soldiers that helped to cement Britain's hold over the subcontinent of India. So armies themselves have been recruited from subject people. We see the obstruction of innovation, and what you also end up with effectively then is that these imperialist countries become creditor countries. So the form taken by exploitation actually changes somewhat. The tendency is to think of empire as, for example, seizing a country so that you can extract rubber, which we saw graphically, horribly with the Belgian Empire in the Belgian Congo, simply saying to local chieftains, bring me X amount of rubber, or we'll cut the hands off of your children. and King Leopold actually owned the colony directly as his personal property. So there's a very particular type of extraction of a surplus, and we tend to think of imperialism in those terms. Or, for example, the control of India for whether it's the spice trade or whatever else, and or the Dutch Empire and the Moluccan Islands are concerned with the trade in spices. But actually, what we also then see, because of the interrelationship between industry and the banks, is that instead of mercantile capital, instead of merchants, what you end up with is finance capital controlling the extraction of a surplus through loans. And therefore, and this is something which we still see today, the extraction of a surplus through loans. So you end up with creditor countries, and of course this has to be supported by military power. If the country that's having the surplus extracted from it doesn't pay up, gunboats play their inevitable role. And what, of course, you end up with is what Lenin was arguing, rather than the idea of some sort of peaceful coalescence that Kautsky was putting forward, which you end up with inter-imperialist rivalry war as an intrinsic feature of imperialism. It couldn't be any other way. The idea that you could somehow have a peaceful coalition between imperialist countries, of course, what actually happened, because once the whole of Africa had been divided up, where do you go to expand then? And one of the precipitating factors of World War One, arguably, was the development of a battle fleet by Germany, and Britain seeing that as a threat to the potential, as a potential threat to its domination of world sea trade. And so what you end up with then is rentier nations, such as Britain, the United States, and right up until the First World War, Britain was a creditor nation. After the First World War, that started to decline. So although in 1918, the British Empire reached its kind of geographical peak, nevertheless, it was already in decline in one sense, in that it had already become a debtor nation. And its decline followed after that. So rentier nations are seen as by Lenin as part of a parasitic and decaying capitalism. So note a couple of things here. First of all, the idea of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. If it's a stage of capitalism, does that mean to say there was a period when there was no imperialism in capitalism? And that seems to be implied by the idea of a counterposition between the heroic period of ascendant capitalism and its decline. The other aspect of it, of course, is if it's the highest stage of capitalism, where does it go from there? And of course, that then poses the question: was Lenin may have seemed highly prescient at the time, but does that mean that subsequently it's proven to be false? Because after all, what we've seen is, despite World War One, World War Two, capitalism in general, imperialism in particular, it continues to exert its influence, or does it? One of the things that's interesting about the current position of the US hegemon, which has, of course, taken over from the British Empire as world hegemon, is its increasing difficulty in actually maintaining control over the world. On the one hand, it can exert enormous power as a direct result of military struggle, but in a sense that's already possibly a feature of decline, because it is still economically relatively weak, fantastically powerful relative to most of the world. But where does that leave a country like China, for example, where we do see the export of capital and the development of relationships between China and African countries? So China is already arguably an imperialist country. And what you end up with then is what Lenin was arguing, not some sort of peaceful division of the world, but an inter-imperialist rivalry with the intrinsic threat of war. And from that point of view, it's one way of seeing the world in which we live in today, where, for example, the Ukraine war is being waged as a proxy war by NATO, which effectively is the satellite states of the USA and its satellites effectively against Russia, with the possibility of the encirclement of China. And from that point of view, imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, seems as prescient as it has ever been. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ian. Yes, if you could switch off your... Brilliant. Thank you very much. Comrades, if you have any questions or comments, please click raise hand and I'll bring you in. So that was a very good introduction, Ian. You did touch on a few questions I had there right at the end, this question of highest stage or lowest stage, I was there. If imperialism is the highest stage, can you have capitalism without imperialism? I mean, some people argue that imperialism is very much part and parcel of capitalism, that you can't really have a form of capitalism where imperialism and the expansion internationally is not a feature. Do you think that is correct, or do you see a phase of capitalism without imperialism?
I personally, echoey, what that is. I would argue that capitalism has always been imperialist. However, that was the reason why I spent a little bit of time on the context, really, because I don't think Lenin would have argued. I think he was arguing the way he was arguing because of that debate with Kautsky, because of the importance of the fight for world revolution then and there. This was published in 1917. So the problem is this idea of Lenin being used as a sort of textbook, as a piece of holy scripture. That particular book was written with particular questions in mind at a particular time. I think there's nothing in Lenin's other writings to think that he wasn't already aware that there had been imperial type exploitation. After all, I mean, Marx's Capital is full of examples about the way in which primitive accumulation is one of the features of imperial exploitation. I mean, the wool trade, for example, in medieval England, was a way in which capital was accumulated, and of course part of that was to do with the seizure of common lands from peasants, and of course it was tied up with mercantile capital. So arguably, capitalism has always been imperialist. But I think we'll come on to that more when we look at some of Lenin's critics, in particular Rosa Luxemburg. But yeah, I personally would argue that it's always been capitalist. But and that, having said that, I think whilst it looks as if Lenin was wrong, but actually I think the importance of the inter-imperialist rivalry, the inter-imperialist war, is central to our consideration of imperialism today.
Sorry, I think there's something wrong with my audio as well. It's a bit echoey. But in terms of, say, for example, in the Ukraine-Russia war, some comrades will look at Russia and say, well, Russia isn't really imperialist because it's not, yes, it's invaded Ukraine, but that was a sort of defensive war, whatever. But Russia isn't really imperialist, so we have to support it. Others look at Russia and say, well, it is imperialist, because it has gone into Ukraine and it's got its eye on the rest of Europe, and that means we have to look at who's the bigger imperialist threat today, etc. Do you think that is a useful way to look at the situation currently as it is?
I would argue not. From the point of view of Russia being imperialist because it invaded Ukraine. I think, again, we come back to that question. And Kautsky makes the point as well, which is, so not everything Kautsky said was wrong after all. But the mere acquisition of land, the acquisition of territory can be not an imperialist project, but simply a nationalist one. And I think that's probably what you see with Russia. What you see is a nationalist appropriation of part of Ukrainian territory, which had, after all, been previously part of a greater Russian empire. Um, the, the, the political choice between one empire or another, do you choose the lesser of two evils, as it were, is one of those things that has plagued the left, in no small part because of the way in which Lenin has been treated as holy scripture, rather than any kind of discussion from a Marxist perspective. If one starts from the point of view with regard to imperialism that we're opposed to our own ruling class, if we start from the idea of the inherent internationalism of the communist project, then one can't. Firstly, it isn't necessary to support one side against the other. Secondly, it's a question of we oppose NATO, we oppose our own ruling class because they are the imperialist power. Rather than choosing between Russia and Ukraine, it is the USA, Britain, France, Germany, and so on. That is the imperialist power that's currently waging war, and if necessary, to the last Ukrainian against Russia. And doing so as precisely part of that wish to encircle China. If you could dismember Russia, for example, and turn it into a vassal state of the US empire, then you have not only its vast resources to draw upon, but you can neutralize a potential military threat from there allied with China.
I mean, you're touching there on a point which I was going to ask you about before bringing in comrades from the floor, is the question of the main enemy is at home, which is it in this text? And perhaps you can expand a little bit about it more. I mean, for us, the main enemy is, we want to stop weapons being sent to Ukraine, Russia, to Palestine, to Israel. That's our task, isn't it? For us here, communist socialists in Britain, that's what we could actually try to achieve, with strong unions, strong activities against it. For socialists and in Ukraine and in Russia, the task is a different one, then, isn't it? It's overthrowing their own regime. Can you expand on that a little bit, perhaps?
Yeah, I think that it Lenin doesn't talk about the enemy as at home in imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. However, as we know, Lenin did talk about the need to turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And I think that lies at the heart of it. So for Lenin, again, the main enemy is at home. You oppose your own ruling class. And if that means taking a revolutionary defeatist position, then so be it. I have no interest whatsoever in the idea of a NATO victory at the expense of hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian and Russian lives. And similarly, I have no interest whatsoever in the idea of a US domination of China or anywhere else in the world. And therefore, my opposition is to our own ruling class. And similarly, I was talking to a comrade the other day who's in the RCP. That's the current iteration of RCP, and that's who was talking to a Ukrainian comrade who said, he wants, for example, Russia to be beaten, but that then places him very firmly in the pro-imperialist camp. What should Ukrainians do? Obviously, if your country is invaded, but it's a difficult position. But you would still, I would argue, be in favour of the overthrow of the pro-imperialist forces in Ukraine, the pro-capitalist forces in Ukraine. workers have got no more to gain from Zelensky. The workers in Russia have got to gain from Putin. If anything, the workers of Russia and Ukraine have everything to gain by overthrowing their respective leaders and ending the war in a revolutionary way.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ian. Matthew, please.
Sorry, you've put me on unmute. Okay. Thanks, comrades. No, it was very good by Ian. I agree with most of what you said. I mean, in these terms, I mean, imperialism is extremely important, as it is actually the form that capitalism takes. And as you say, there's an evolution. I mean, obviously we now see an imperialism which is dominated by finance capital, and we don't have colonial empire, etc. Obviously, we see the problem being, of course, if you here in Glasgow, it is very much an imperial city. The whole place was built on basically with either trade with on advantageous terms colonies, or else the provision of capital goods to colonies. I mean, you look at through all the big companies in Glasgow, through the 19th and 20th century. I mean, all the big engineering companies, that's what they did. The whole city was built on the back of the thing. Which people don't seem to don't seem to understand. Unfortunately. But I mean, now, obviously it's different, as you say. I mean, I think the problem is, I think also in those terms is this formulation that people have come up with, and I'm not, I think it originates actually with the issue of the invasion of Ethiopia by the Italians in the 30s, that whenever an imperialist country invades a colony or an imperialized country, therefore you automatically support the non-imperialist country. Which, I mean, obviously in the situation of the Ethiopian, the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, you would, but not necessarily apply to all things. I mean, I think the question of saying, well, what is the fundamental question here is, what is the interest of the working class? And the thing is, obviously, in imperialist countries, the interest of the working class is always in the defeat of their own ruling class. Whenever it goes to war, we wouldn't support it. Obviously, there's there have been issues like the Second World War, in which was a debate around that whole question in terms of how that was brought about. But however, we're not dealing with that situation now. It's quite clear that the imperialists are a bunch of looters. It's also the actual function of imperialism itself. That we're dealing with a decaying empire in the American empire, which is based on, obviously not based on colonies, it's based on finance capital. And as America itself's capacity declines, and it relies ever more heavily on militarism and killing people, that it's then a question, well, how is that going to play out? And the real danger, I mean, and it's not minor danger, is actually the start of a major war, because obviously, I mean, our dear Keir Starmer, having been elected to by some fluke, his first major international act actually was to try and start World War III by saying, well, we will start firing missiles at Russia. Which is quite bizarre, really. I mean, in the conditions in which, these things would have been fired by British personnel, because Ukrainians are not in a position to do it. So it would have been direct war with Russia, under conditions in which, actually, as pointed out, the Russians then contacted the Americans and said, well, if you actually do this, you understand what we're going to target. Here's a list of what we're going to target. We can assume that included London. And the Americans said, no, okay, we'll not do that now. There was a certain debate within the Biden administration, and they decided not to do it, because obviously that was the start of World War III. Now, I mean, the point is, I mean, Starmer and Lammy and so on become ridiculous, because obviously they, you're dealing with a moth-eaten power, which is basically wants to start a war, but is incapable of actually fighting the damn thing. So in those terms, very, very serious. But the actual evolution of the system is really important. I think the other point also is to say, well, the system is still run by the US. There's this notion that seems to be floating around that the Israelis run things, which is bizarre. I mean, absolutely bizarre in material terms. The Israelis are allowed to do certain things by the US. The US provide actually basically everything that's been dropped on Gaza has come from the US. There's a massive airlift and a huge shipping operation to provide them with all the ammunition, etc., and huge numbers of armored vehicles, etc., all the things required for the assault on Gaza. So the genocide is Joe Biden's. Genocide Joe is the right name for the man. But the point being is that it's actually the US that is in control. And they will call the shots. They will allow the Israelis to do certain things. And some quite broad liberty to do that, because obviously the point being is that Israel is so central to the control of the Middle East for the US. That's its value. The Americans obviously decided that after the '67 war, and it's become that linchpin of that control of the Middle East. Now, I mean, from that point of view, they want to preserve it. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Matthew. Do you want to say anything on that, Ian, or shall I take some more?
By all means, take some more.
Okay, John, I think, wants to speak, but doesn't have a camera. You can speak now, John. There's two Johns, actually, John Tumman and John Fitzpatrick. I think you both want to speak. Who's talking first? John.
Hi.
Hi. Yeah.
Don't I have my camera on?
Oh, sorry, there's two then. Okay, John Fitzgerald, you start, and John Tumman, you want to come in? I'll make you panelist, yeah?
Yeah, please.
Okay, you have to accept being made a panelist. I tried a few times. Okay, John Fitzgerald, you start speaking. Sorry.
Yeah, just a couple of points. Thanks, Ian and Matthew, for your contribution. I suppose for me, there's really two questions. In which way do we really consider China as being imperialist? And the other is Ukraine, where, as we see, there's been a split on the left in terms of, as there was, even with the Second World War against fascism, as to how we as a nation or as a working class can help another working class, which, the unions in Ukraine have appealed for our help as such. So in a way, it's like putting a human face on it, I suppose. I feel the need to put a human face on it. Although we know that, I know, and we all know that NATO, what they're up to and what they're up to with China. Each country, in my view, does have a right to its own self-determination. And if it gets caught up in such a, all the people, the working class themselves get caught up in a situation which is none of their doing, then I feel that, other countries, working classes, do have to defend them in the best way they probably can. I mean, if we were invaded, I'm not sure exactly how we take it. It is complex. I've had discussions about it, with various people. The other thing is, I'm kind of interested in this idea of the Yanis, the ex can never pronounce his second name. Yanis anyone?
Yanis Varoufakis.
Yeah. And his idea about the end of capitalism and the beginning of techno-feudalism, and the fact that the only countries that actually own cloud capital are China and the United States, and that Europe is nowhere in that respect. That's what I really wanted to say.
Okay, thanks, John. Do you want to answer some of that, Ian?
There's a few things in the question, the chat as well. Undoubtedly, Russia was an imperialist country in terms of its expansion into Central Asia, for example, its expansion eastwards. But one of the features of the 1917 revolution was it effectively took Russia out of imperialist relations altogether. France was a huge investor in Russia. Russia's own capitalist development was, as people know, very much skewed by foreign investment, foreign capital. France was heavily damaged by the Russian Revolution because it lost a great deal of investment that it had put into Russia. Can one say that the Soviet Union was imperialist? I would argue not. You're not really talking about the extraction of a surplus in the way that you are with bourgeois imperialism. You are talking about impeding the development of whole groups of people. You are talking about the restriction of the right of nations to self-determination in the former Soviet Union. You are talking about a regime which was brutal and impeded the development of an international workers' movement. There is a lot of reasons to be glad that the Soviet Union is gone. But on the other hand, what you had, I suppose, was something of a countervailing force against US imperialism. And that's one argument that is sometimes put forward, not necessarily defending the Soviet Union, but arguing, well, would the Iraq War have happened had the Soviet Union still been in existence? It's a moot point. I'm still glad to see the back of the Soviet Union. I still think it was more of an impediment than anything else. And I don't think it's an imperialist country in the same way. It isn't exporting capital. It isn't invading Ukraine in order to extract a surplus from Ukraine. It is purely about territorial control and domination under circumstances where where Russia itself is being encircled by imperialist countries allied to NATO. I mean, just think of the addition recently of Finland and Sweden and so on, previously neutral countries which have been added to NATO. So the encirclement of Russia is a prelude to the encirclement of China. One can say that China, it is in a sense imperialist, because if we look at the surplus that's been extracted from Africa, a series of African countries, because of Chinese investments, and Chinese investments which have been regarded as preferable because they're cheaper for some other countries. And of course, so we're seeing the export of capital, we're seeing the extraction of the surplus, and we're seeing the development of Chinese finance capital. And interestingly, things like technological dominance in certain areas. So I think there is an important qualitative and quantitative difference between Russia and China. I think there's an important difference between, and there's certainly an important difference between China and the USA, both in terms of military power and what we might call the imperial reach. It's not, again, one doesn't have to sort of choose between the imperialism of China or the imperialism of the USA. We're opposed to imperialism. We're opposed to our own ruling class. We're opposed to the ruling class of the world. And we make common cause with those who are with us. That doesn't mean to say embracing nationalist movements necessarily, although sometimes we would embrace a nationalist movement if it was in the position of being, because we are on the side of the poor and dispossessed. And if it's a nationalist movement that's fighting back, then one would give it support, however qualified.
Yes, interesting. I think that's a good division to distinguish between USSR and Russia on the one hand, and also Russia and China. John Tummen then.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you very much, Ian. I want to question whether Lenin's book or pamphlet is the best place to start a series on imperialism, and the best place for Marxists to actually think about imperialism and its relationship to capitalism. I think that Lenin's pamphlet, and I'm even surer of that after listening to Ian's introduction, is a pamphlet about capitalism. It is in a sense, an update of Marx's own descriptions of and analysis of capitalism in the mid and late 19th century. What Lenin, I think, confuses is he brings imperialism into his discussion of capitalism because of what he calls inter-imperialist rivalry, which in a sense is just a continuation of what France and Britain were doing during the mercantilist era, which only ended in the mid-19th century. And so Lenin never dealt with what I would call the Russian doll problem. Does capitalism contain imperialism, which the title of his book implies is the case, or does imperialism contain capitalism? And I think you have to go back to the territory which Lenin never looked at, which is the mercantilist empires, which were built from the 17th century onwards, well, even earlier in the case of the beginnings of the Portuguese and Spanish empires. I'm reading a book at the moment, a very interesting book on the relationship between the slave trade and the profits from slavery and the Industrial Revolution. There's a hell of a lot of new scholarly research being done on that, which tends to back up what Eric Williams, the Trinidadian, I think it's Trinidadian writer, wrote in 1944. And which is that without mercantilist empire, and particularly the slave trade and the plantation economy, which was technologically a driver for the Industrial Revolution in so many ways, which are brought out in this book, and I'm only about a third of the way through it. Those enabled through what they did to the banking system, to the entire range of financial industries, to the to consumption of sugar, cotton materials, coffee, tea, all the rest of it, altered the economy and made it possible through the accumulation of capital to actually invest in the Industrial Revolution in this country. And the very fact that Britain defeated France in the 18th century wars, what was called what can be thought of as the First World War, and it's normally called the 7 Years' War between 56 and 64, that's 1756, where Britain defeated France in Canada, in India, and other places as well. That was crucial, and that was part of the project of the Act of Succession and the so-called Glorious Revolution, which came at the end of the 17th, beginning of the 18th century. So here we have imperialism birthing capitalism, industrial capitalism, imperialism and mercantilist empire, which, as I say, only ended in the mid-19th century. And what was new was the mass acquisition of colonies rather than the acquisition of colonies for particular purposes with a particular economic project run by the state in mind. And that was new. And I think that Lenin got confused with all of those things. I think that what he produced was an amazing scholastic achievement. The number of notebooks he filled in that library was absolutely amazing. But he was, in a very important sense, trying to get to grips with changes in capitalism since what Marx had written 20, 30, 40 years, 50, 60 years earlier. And he did that very well. But I think by bringing imperialism into it, he failed to recognize the difference between imperialism and colonialism, for a start. And that has plagued the left's misunderstanding of imperialism in the 20th century, when there was the era after the Second World War, especially, of decolonization. Lots of people on the left then thought, oh, we don't have imperialism anymore because imperialism is the same as colonialism. Well, it's not. And I think we realize that now. But I think there's a lot to unravel in imperialism. I think this is a very important start, but I don't see Lenin's book as the best starting place, I'm afraid.
Interesting points, John. Ian, what do you think? Was Lenin confused?
No, I think Lenin was aware of those things. I mean, you can't read Volume 1 of Capital without being aware of the importance of mercantilism in turn as a powerful impetus to the development of industrial capitalism. Without that primitive accumulation, as it were, without it, it would have been impossible. And of course, it was intimately bound up with things like, the French Revolution, the slave rebellion in Haiti, for example, which was one of France's most prosperous colonies, which is why Britain tried to seize it and both armies were roundly beaten by Toussaint Louverture. I think what's different, and the reason why I think Lenin's not a bad place to start, we could have started in any number of places. But the reason why Lenin's not a bad place to start is firstly because of the uses and misuses of Lenin. And I thought that was an important point, and the reason why we should bring that in there. The fact that it's waved at you as a kind of a piece of holy scripture as to how we even consider the question of imperialism. Lenin was writing it at a particular time for a particular reason, and I don't think Lenin would have argued that it was something that would hold true for all time. And in all circumstances. It's the nature of the surplus as well. This is why I think what is important about Lenin is the emphasis on finance capital. Because today, we don't necessarily need to send an army into a country to exploit it. We can do it through the international finance system. And you see this everywhere. Desperately poor countries in hock to very rich countries. And a country like Nigeria has extraordinary poverty, despite the fact that it has vast oil wealth. Well, where's that going? It's certainly not going into the pockets of the ordinary working class Nigerians. And but I think, you know, if you contrast that, for example, with what happened in Iraq, although people talked about it's a war about oil, and it's, you know, maybe it wouldn't have happened had they not had oil, maybe, but I don't think it was about oil. It was about the assertion of the power of a world hegemon under circumstances in which it couldn't otherwise control the situation. In a sense, by the time you're having to send an army in to seize territory, you've already lost, because you're not, you know, it's hugely wasteful, hugely destructive. Incidentally, that was even, and this is a point which is made by Lenin, during the kind of what we might call the heroic period of capitalism, say from 1840 through to about 1880, when you've got you know, free trade capitalism, if you will, there were plenty among the bourgeoisie who were arguing against imperialism. And that's why I said that Hobson, in a sense, was the last of a whole generation of people that argued against imperialism, because it was enormously wasteful and enormously expensive, because you know, impeded the development of forces and relations of production in imperialist countries and so on. And, you know, it was Hobson's absolute revulsion at what Britain was doing in South Africa that caused him to write his book.
Thank you. There's an interesting comment by Matthew, I thought, in the chat when we're talking about China. In your view, imperialist, is of course true that it's not even proper capitalist. I mean, there isn't, you know, it's not a proper working class. It can't sell its labor power freely, etc. How does that work? So you can have imperialism without proper capitalism, you think?
It's a bizarre, distorted form of capitalism, isn't it? I mean, I would argue that it's some sort of capitalism. I don't know enough really to properly theorize it. I don't, you know, but you know, whereas you know, I knew enough about Russia to accept that, to argue that it wasn't in any sense capitalist, state or otherwise, and certainly wasn't a worker state of any description. China is a bit different. You do see capital accumulation. You do see the export of capital. You do see workers selling their labor power and a surplus being extracted. It's a very strange stratification of the workforce as well, isn't it? Where you've got certain people, certain parts of the Chinese working class working in relatively privileged industries. I mean, the people who work making iPhones, for example, are doing considerably better than others. But it is a bizarre form of capitalism. I mean, you know, but then, you know, much of early capitalism wasn't democratic either, even in the bourgeois sense of democracy. I think that obviously needs to be properly theorized by somebody who knows more about it than me. But I would argue that China is capitalist. But one of the features of the decline of capitalism, I think, is that you get precisely that. You get these distorted forms. You know, we're not going to see China revert to some sort of heroic free trade form of capitalism. And insofar as it's imperialist, it is very much a kind of junior imperialist power. It is nowhere near the power of the USA in terms of its imperial influence.
Well, of course, empires, as you said, they come and they go. By definition, nothing lasts forever. So China at the moment looks like it might be the next big imperialist country, which is, of course, what perhaps the war in Ukraine is about, to tell China, stay in your lane. Marion, please.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting discussion tonight. But I want to raise a couple of things. A lot of the left supported Cameron and the others destroying Libya. What's Libya like today? And part of the problem we have on the left is that they've been sold or swallowed hook, line and sinker that liberal democracy is better than anything else. Well, most of the world doesn't even have liberal democracy anyway. And I'm not for liberal democracy. I want the working class to be able to take power across the globe. And with regard to Ukraine, Victoria Nuland has recently stated that in 2014, there was an agreement that Ukraine and Russia were happy with until Victoria Nuland and the Americans stopped that deal going through. Now, why is this? Because if Russia was just, well, some people call it gangster capitalism, all that kind of rubbish. I don't. I don't think that all of the industry in Russia has gone back to capitalism. I still think there's elements of a degenerated worker state there. And for me, who overthrows Putin is key. I don't want imperialism to take over the whole of Russia, because that would be a big defeat for the working class internationally. You talk to a lot of people from the global south, they have a different attitude to Russia and China with the investment that Russia and China put into those countries. They don't see it from the eyes of the West. Now, the key thing that people said earlier today, our task is to combat our own imperialist and capitalist countries. Now, a lot of the argument around Ukraine was around the existing world order. That's why the EU came in, and a lot of the other countries said, because they want to keep the existing world order. Well, I'm not in favour of the existing world order. I want to see the international working class taking over everywhere and have a well-planned economy based on democracy. But the crimes of Stalinism on the national question and on a lot of the others, obviously has weakened it and made it easy for the West to attack it. But our task is to actually fight for real democracy, working class democracy, and we don't have it in the West at all. We have liberal democracy. Well, apparently we have these freedoms, which we don't. I mean, some people weren't able to vote in these last elections because they didn't have voter ID. Well, what kind of democracy is that? How do we actually develop and build internationalism, which is key as well? So for me, the key thing is we have to look very carefully at things, because a lot of the left swallowed Libya hook, line and sinker. They swallowed it. And what's Libya like today? Are the people in Libya any better off today than they were before? No, they're not. And one of the reasons they did Libya was Gaddafi was talking about having a different currency to the US dollar. And that's why they attacked him. And that's another reason why they're also attacking Russia and China, because they're setting up the BRIC and things like that, which they're afraid of being some other pole of attraction. Obviously, we don't want any trap with any of that. We want to build the international working class that will overthrow capitalism in all its form and do an end to imperialism and imperialist wars. But we're in the danger now because, unfortunately, the left in this country has not been building an anti-nuclear war movement or an anti-war movement because of the misunderstanding of what's actually happening in Ukraine. And let's not forget that some of the far-right Ukrainians were actually murdering people in the East, and Putin saw that as an excuse. But we're not in favour of. We're in favour of working class people uniting together to overcome it. But Russia is petrified of being encircled. The memory of the Second World War is much more in the minds of the Russian people because of the hundreds of the millions that were murdered in the Second World War. Now we're internationalists. We're not for this. But if you don't understand and you go along with your own imperialists, which a lot of the left have done on Ukraine, and why you see all this stuff about what Russia's done, not a half of criticism of what Israel is doing today. Israel is wiping out, and now they want to go into Lebanon and all, and they want to have the greater Israel that went back to Balfour and before him. So what? Why isn't there such a movement that has stopped and put maximum pressure in this country on the Labour government to actually boycott Israel and stop sending all arms to Israel, and actually pushing harder to stop what's going on in Palestine? We're walking slowly into the annihilation of the human race.
Thanks, Marion. Yes, I have comrades coming to Liverpool on Saturday to the pro-Palestine demonstration, and then the next one, October the 5th in London. Ian, I suggest I read out a quick question by Murray. We'll bring in Anthony, and then you come in, unless you want to speak now. No? Okay. So Murray asked an interesting question. It's basically, if I understand it rightly, the transition, socialism, communism, how would we do it? How would we organize it in a way to stop capitalists running international trade? And the same question is really, how do we stop capitalists nationally? I guess is a similar question. Or how would they stop them doing things like historically the East India Company, the Virginia Company, distributing and concentrating investment and exploitation of labor, etc. So how do we enforce our own organizations, working class organizations from below, I guess is the question. Anthony, then.
Yes, I'm going to start from what Marion did, but I'm going to start from theoretical debate, because a lot of these disputes on the class nature of Russia, Eastern Europe, China go back a very long way. I think the first image you got to recognise in 1917, a sixth of the world overthrew capitalism and created the workers' state. Before then, you had the anti-imperialist conflict and colonialism. Now, before I go on to the main debate, I want to say on John, they always talked about imperialism in the Third World and colonialism by Marx and Lenin and Trotsky. But what you're not seeing is uneven and combined development. And the difference under mercantile capital, it didn't dominate the world. Marx said in the Communist Manifesto, imperial capitalism would dominate the world market. And it was wrong in some respects about knocking things about the Chinese walls as being progressive. The world market was in the international division level, not the set back all the productive forces of the colonies. I'll just start with that. Now, the thing is, what Cannon said in the dispute on the class nature of the Soviet Union in 1939, when you have a socialist revolution like Russia, which is carried on now into a third of the world, it's the greatest test. It's the greatest test for the international working class. It's divided social democracy from Marxists, anarchists, liberals, Stalinists. What became the third camp tendency. They've seen no difference between the workers' states and capitalism. And those were adapted to Stalinism and democratic rights in fighting Stalinism. This is the key dividing line. But you can't be neutral in the revolution. It's the most crucial class question. And that's the first thing I want to say in this debate. There's most of the talks are very good here because they start from a historical materialist point of view. There's no analysis who runs the economy, who owns the main means of production, because you've had wage labour in every stage of the workers' states. But the difference with capitalism is expropriated capitalist mode of production, essentially, because it's a socialisation of the means of production. You have the bourgeois norms of distribution in terms of wage labour and certain things are commodities. Well, that's why you can't build socialism in one country. But now you have to see what imperialism's after. It wants to overthrow the workers' states, then it's going to move into the third world and recolonise everything. I'm not a campist. When those said that imperialism could do what it's like in the semi-colonies after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they couldn't do it in Iraq. They couldn't do it in other parts of the world because the semi-colonial bourgeoisie had its own autonomous interest for imperialism, and the mass would fight against imperialism. But even Yeltsin, I read the Indian papers with my dad when I was at work once in 2000, and Yeltsin, even he was under direct pressure of imperialism, capitalist pressure, kept the arms industry going in order to undermine imperialism, and he had to fight them in Iraq, and he went in Serbia. So there's been a shift under Putin towards to renationalise certain things. And what they're battling Ukraine is, to sum up, is a battle against capitalist restoration. The democratic rights you win are important. To fight Stalinism and the capitalist inroads. Steve Freeman went one extreme when he had I'll finish on this, on the Revolutionary Democratic Group in 1990. It's one thing to defend democratic rights over Stalin. He said if they moved privatization, they pushed forward a bourgeois democratic parliament over the degenerate workers' state. Obviously, I wouldn't be for the suppression of that parliament. But if there's a struggle between capitalists and the civil war and the bureaucrats, you have the United Front to suppress the capitalists like Ukraine, to defeat capitalist restoration, but keep your political independence from the Stalinists, fight for workers' democracy, fight for self-determination. As we said in the Second World War, a Ted Grant, from Lutrovic to Ted Grant, and Canada, defend the Soviet Union with internationalist methods, with the methods of world socialism, fight for workers' democracy. And the final point is, even when you see Freeman was wrong, when that parliament is crushed, then fight for workers' democracy, overthrow Stalinism, but fight for the max. Raymond O'Neill was the other extreme. He dismissed five democratic demands as automatically leading to capitalist restoration. And when he made that mistake, he moved towards Stalinism. These are some of the dangers which are there. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, comrade. Okay, Ian, I think we're summing up now as well. You okay with that? There's no more comments.
The first thing I want to say is how much of Marion's arguments I agreed with. I think what's absolutely needed, in a sense, is a communist anti-war movement, because what we have at the moment is a sort of social pacifist anti-war movement that tries to draw some kind of distinction between what's happening in Ukraine and in Palestine. Ukraine and Palestine are intimately bound up together, and one can't see it in any other way. Israel is, as one of our comrades puts it, the gendarme of the Middle East. It is, America's unsinkable aircraft carrier. And without understanding that, you can't separate that from what NATO is currently doing in Ukraine. So the idea that you could, for example, be kind of soft on the Ukraine war in the way that Greta Thunberg has been recently, but supportive of the Palestinians, is hopelessly contradictory. There needs to be a communist anti-war movement which stresses the importance of our inherent internationalism. As I've said before, internationalism is not something which is an add-on. Something that is nice if you can afford it. And that brings me on to Murray's point. Any world communist movement has to be concerned with, as it were, the reconstruction of large parts of the world which have been laid waste to by capitalism in general, imperialism in particular. I mean, Mariam was absolutely right about Libya. But of course, there's also been Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and the list goes on and on and on. At the same time, we've got people purporting to be on the left who want some sort of concession to immigration controls. We could talk about the Communist Party of Britain or the Workers' Party of Britain. Want to get into the numbers game one way or another. What has to happen is something of the nature of a Marshall Plan for the world. And that's important for all sorts of reasons, partly because of its inherent justice. We have vast amounts of wealth concentrated in certain countries at the expense of those other countries. That's just the point. That wealth, that whole point about the relative privilege that we enjoy in Britain, the United States, Australia, Canada, and so on, it is at the expense of those other countries. And therefore, any revolutionary movement has to work on the basis of internationalism and has to work on the basis of the redevelopment of those countries. After all, to talk about a migrant crisis, there isn't a migrant crisis. There's an imperialism crisis. There's a capitalism crisis that's destroying tracts of the world and giving people no choice. Effectively, it's already a bloodbath out there, and unless something is done about capitalism in general, imperialism in particular, and this is why I think that Lenin is a good place to start, because you can't just use it as holy scripture. It has to be a guide to political action. It has to be a guide to political action here and now, and there has to be a way of opposing the imperialist adventure in Ukraine as well as in Palestine, and on the same basis that we oppose our own ruling class, and we oppose it on the basis that we're in favor of a communist world that will reconstruct the world.
Strong finish there. Thank you very much, Ian. Excellent introduction to a really important series. Thank you, comrade. Comrades, hopefully you can join us next week. We're back with the Communist Culture Club, where we're taking a look at Ursula K. Le Guin, and particularly her book, The Dispossessed, will be introduced by Lee Garrett, who, of course, wrote his book about anti-Semitism and the Labour Party, Chris Williamson, all of that. Looking forward to that. Thank you very much, Ian. A very thoughtful first session. Comrades, if you are interested in presenting a subject to a future session, get in touch, info@ymarx.com, either on the question of imperialism or related issues, or a cultural issue. Thank you very much, Ian. Thank you very much, comrades. See you next week. Bye-bye.